The cold porch light flickered above me as I stood there clutching a single suitcase, the night air sharp enough to sting my lungs. I remember the weight of it all, the smoke still clinging to my clothes, the exhaustion buried in my bones, and the look on my daughter's face as she froze in the doorway. If you've ever reached out to someone you love only to find a wall where you expected warmth, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Moments like this carve themselves into you. I felt the ground shift under me that night, as if the world had tilted and I was the only one who noticed. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment that would break me open and rebuild me in ways I never expected. Let me show you how it all began. I never thought the coldest moment of my life would happen on my own daughter's front porch. One minute I was standing there with my suitcase, still smelling the smoke from everything I had just lost. And the next, I was being told I couldn't come inside. Not even for the night. Not even for an hour. The shock hit me so fast I could feel my knees weaken, as if my body understood the betrayal before my mind did. My name is Ellen Brooks. I'm 67 years old, a retired nurse, and I've spent my whole life in a small town just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. I've taken care of strangers in their most fragile moments. Yet in the moment I needed someone, anyone, I found myself staring at a door that would not open for me. I remember standing there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation, some reason my own daughter would turn me away after everything that had just happened. But all I felt was this sinking heaviness, a kind of humiliation that settles into your bones. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just felt myself folding inward, quietly, as if the world had tilted and I was sliding off the edge. And as I stood on that porch, the truth pressed down hard. This moment wasn't coming out of nowhere. This hurt had roots. It had history. And to understand how I ended up homeless on my daughter's doorstep, I have to go back to the night everything burned. I still remember waking up around 2:30 a.m. to a strange popping sound, the kind that doesn't belong inside a quiet house. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I smelled something sharp and bitter. When I opened my bedroom door, a wave of thick smoke pushed toward me, and everything inside me snapped awake. I didn't have time to think. I just moved. I grabbed my shoes, my old purse, and the folder where I kept my important papers, and I ran. The air outside was cold enough to sting, but my skin felt hot, as if the fire were clinging to me. I stood in the yard barefoot on one side, holding the few things I could carry, watching flames claw through the windows. In a matter of seconds, the home I had lived in for more than 20 years became a lantern in the dark. I could hear the structure groan, as if it were exhaling its last breath. I kept waiting for the shock to fade, but it didn't. It just changed shape, turning into a kind of numbness that made everything feel far away. The firefighters worked fast, but there wasn't much to save. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened shell and the smell of wet ashes. The Red Cross found a room for me at a small roadside motel, the kind with scratchy towels and humming air conditioners. I stayed there night after night, staring at the ceiling, trying to process how a whole life could disappear in minutes. Every memory, every photograph, every piece of normalcy had turned into smoke, drifting into a sky that didn't care. Those days in the motel were painfully quiet. I kept telling myself to be grateful I was alive, but survival felt like a thin blanket against everything I had lost. Eventually, the silence pushed me to reach out. I told myself that family would understand. I told myself that asking for help was the next right step. And that's what led me to my daughter's doorstep. Reaching out to Megan felt like the only step left after the fire. I remember sitting on the edge of that motel bed, the air conditioner rattling in the background, telling myself that family was where you turned when life collapsed. I tried to keep my voice steady when I called her, tried to make it sound simple, temporary. But even before she answered, I felt this small knot forming in my stomach, as if my body already knew what my heart didn't want to face. She sounded distant, careful, like someone weighing every word before letting it out. I could hear the hesitation, even without hearing the words themselves. It was the kind of pause that told me she was already pulling back, already searching for reasons this couldn't be her responsibility. I reassured her that I only needed a place to land for a moment, but her silence stretched long enough to bruise. The morning I arrived at her house, I carried one suitcase and the weight of every memory we had ever shared. I kept hoping that seeing me in person would soften whatever wall she had built. But when she opened the door, the distance I felt over the phone was written all over her face. She didn't need to explain anything. I understood the moment her eyes shifted away. That quiet, careful step backward said more than any refusal ever could. Standing there, feeling the cool air from inside her home slip past me without invitation, something inside me changed. The disappointment was sharp at first, but it cooled quickly into something quieter, something harder, a recognition, a turning point. I walked away from that doorstep knowing I had no place to go. And that's how I ended up living in my car for the next 6 months. That first night in my car felt unreal, as if my mind refused to accept what my life had become. I parked behind a 24-hour grocery store, telling myself it was only for one night, just until I figured out a plan. But when I leaned the seat back and pulled my coat over my chest, the reality settled in like a cold weight. The windows fogged quickly, and I wiped them with the sleeve of my sweater, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. I kept thinking about the warmth of the home I had lost and the door that had closed in my face. Within a week, I settled into a kind of survival routine. I rotated between 3 parking lots to avoid drawing attention. I used the restroom at a gas station where the attendants pretended not to notice me. In the mornings, I drove to the library to sit in a quiet corner, charging my phone and reading anything that helped me forget how far I had fallen. Nights were the hardest. The cold crept in early, and there were moments when I pressed my palms together just to feel some trace of heat. More than once, I woke up to the sound of my own teeth chattering. Winter was especially cruel. I layered every piece of clothing I still owned, yet the chill always found its way in. I remember sitting in the driver's seat, watching my breath fog the air, wondering how a person could disappear so quietly from her own life. There were days I barely recognized myself. Hunger made my thoughts slow, and exhaustion made even simple tasks feel heavy. During that entire stretch of months, Megan called me only once. She spoke about the kids' soccer games and school projects, filling the conversation with cheerful updates that barely skimmed the surface of my reality. I found myself pretending to be fine, softening the edges of the truth so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. It was a strange kind of loyalty, protecting her feelings while my own life crumbled. Somewhere in those dark months, something shifted inside me. The suffering carved out a new kind of clarity, a quiet understanding that I couldn't keep waiting for someone to save me. I didn't know it then, but the path toward change began in that moment of resolve, before insurance money arrived. After 6 months of drifting between parking lots and gas station lights, the notification from the insurance company felt unreal. I remember staring at my phone, reading the message twice just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The check had cleared. For the first time in half a year, I let myself breathe without the tightness in my chest. It wasn't just money. It was oxygen. It was proof that my life wasn't permanently stuck in that cold, cramped car. I used part of the payout to secure a small studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy. Thin carpet, old appliances, walls that hummed when the heat kicked on. But it had a door I could lock, a shower I didn't have to share with strangers, and a bed that didn't fold into a front seat. The first night I slept there, I woke up before dawn out of habit, expecting to see frost on the windshield. Instead, I saw soft lamplight against plain walls. I cried quietly into the pillow, not out of sadness, but because the simple feeling of safety had become something unfamiliar. Once I settled in, the part of me that had gone numb during those months began to reawaken. I found myself wanting to understand more about my old life, my options, my future. That curiosity led me to the courthouse, where I spent long afternoons looking through property records, trying to piece together what rebuilding might look like. That's when I discovered that the house Megan was renting, my daughter's house, belonged to an aging landlord with a cluttered portfolio and a history of undervaluing his properties. Something stirred in me then. Not anger, not revenge, just the quiet sense that possibility had finally opened its eyes. For the first time in months, I felt a shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable. And that shift is what guided me toward the next decision, buying that property. Walking back into the courthouse felt different this time. I wasn't desperate or lost. I was steady, clear, almost methodical. I went straight to the records room, the same one where I had first traced the old landlord's name. The clerk recognized me and slid over another stack of documents. And as I sifted through them, the full picture finally formed. The man who owned Megan's rental house was slipping into dementia, and his daughter had quietly begun the process of liquidating his entire portfolio. Dozens of properties, all priced well below market value, listed one after another like forgotten entries in a ledger no one expected anyone to read. When I saw the address of Megan's house sitting right there in plain ink, something inside me went still. There was no rush of emotion, no vindictive spark, just a calm, cold clarity settling into place. The asking price was well within reach, even after securing my little studio. It felt almost unreal how easily the numbers aligned, as if life had opened a door I didn't know existed. I remember sitting at one of those old wooden desks, running my fingers along the edge, letting the idea breathe. I wasn't thinking about the past or what she had done. I was thinking about my future, my stability, my right to hold something solid again. And once that thought rooted itself, the decision followed without struggle. The purchase process moved quickly. A few signatures, a cashier's check, a brief meeting in a bland office where the landlord's daughter looked relieved to pass another burden along. And then it was done. I walked out into the parking lot holding a thin folder that said, in unmistakable terms, that I owned the house my daughter lived in. I didn't tell Megan. Not then. Not yet. I wasn't hiding it out of spite. I just needed time to understand the weight of what I had done. After months of being powerless, this moment felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. Quiet, deliberate, undeniable. And with that new steadiness, I went home, opened the lease, and began reviewing the terms as any responsible landlord would. When I finally sat down with the lease, I treated it the way I had once treated medical charts. Slowly, carefully, reading every line as if someone's well-being depended on it. Maybe it did. The first thing that caught my eye was the expiration date. 2 months. That small detail settled over me like a quiet bell. Then I saw the rent amount, and my breath stalled for a moment. It was far below anything close to market value. I checked the local listings just to be sure, scrolling through numbers that confirmed what I already suspected. A house that size in that neighborhood easily rented for around $3,300. For a long time, I just sat there with the papers in my lap, feeling the weight of what I held, not just as a landlord, but as a mother who had slept in a car while this house sat warm and safe. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want to hurt her. What I wanted was fairness, and maybe a little bit of balance after so much imbalance. Raising the rent to the true market rate felt like the only honest decision. It wasn't personal. It was what any landlord would do with an undervalued property and an expiring lease. To keep things clean and professional, I hired a property management company to handle everything. The inspection, the paperwork, the notices. I needed that buffer, not out of fear, but to keep emotion from muddying what needed to be straightforward. When the management company sent out the renewal notice with the updated rent, I felt a strange mix of guilt and clarity. A quiet tension settled in my chest. I knew Megan would see the number soon. I knew it would rattle her. And part of me knew this was the moment everything would start shifting. The moment she would finally reach out. When the renewal notice went out, I imagined it landing in Megan's inbox, like a stone dropped in still water. I didn't have to wonder how she reacted for long. The first sign was the sudden burst of missed calls lighting up my phone. Then came the texts. Long, frantic messages layered with worry about her budget, the kids' routines, and how impossible it would be to manage such a high rent. I could almost feel her panic through the screen. Sharp and breathless. What struck me wasn't the fear itself. It was the timing. For 6 months, I had lived in my car without so much as a real check-in from her. Now, within hours of that notice, she suddenly wanted to know how I was doing, how my health was, whether I had eaten. Each message had the tone of someone trying to rebuild a bridge only because the ground beneath them had started to shake. I read her words slowly, letting them soak in. There was a familiar ache in my chest, the same one that had followed me for years when Megan drifted in and out of my life depending on what she needed. But this time, something inside me felt steadier. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was simply seeing the pattern clearly for the first time, without excuses. Her fear grew with each message. She talked about losing the house, about the kids having to move schools, about how unfair it all felt. And in between her words, I sensed something else, the unspoken belief that I might still step in and save her, the way I always had. I set the phone down and breathed, feeling the truth settle into place. She was scrambling toward me without understanding that I was already woven into the situation in a way she hadn't imagined. And I knew the moment was coming. The moment she would learn exactly whose house she was living in. I chose a quiet afternoon to tell her. The kind where the air feels heavy, as if the world already understands something is about to break. I sat across from Megan at her kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped her with school projects, birthday cakes, all the small things that stitch a life together. She was still shaken from the rent notice, moving with the distracted stiffness of someone bracing for impact. I felt my own pulse slow, a strange mix of fear and steadiness settling into my chest. I didn't dress the moment up. I didn't soften it. I simply let the truth rise inside me until speaking, it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. When I finally told her that I owned the house, that it was my decision, my signature, my authority behind the new rent, I watched the words land on her like a sudden drop in temperature. Her face didn't crumble all at once. It shifted in tiny, stunned increments. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally the dawning realization that everything she had assumed about who held power in our relationship had been turned inside out. She didn't say anything, but I saw it in the way her shoulders sagged, the way her eyes tried to find an explanation in mine. I felt a tight ache in my stomach, a mix of grief and the cold certainty that this moment had been building for years. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was the weight of honesty, heavy, overdue, and irreversible. The silence between us stretched, filled with everything we had never said. As I stood to leave, I knew this was only the beginning of the fallout. And I also knew the harder part was still ahead, deciding how much, if anything, I was willing to save her from now. In the hours after I told Megan the truth, I felt a heaviness settle over me, thick, quiet, almost suffocating. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was the weight of finally saying something I had carried alone for too long. I sat in my small apartment that night, staring at the wall, replaying the look on her face. Shock, then fear, then something that almost looked like recognition. The next morning, the messages began. Long, trembling appeals layered with practical worries and emotional pleas. She talked about the kids, the school district, the bills piling up, She said she needed time, needed understanding, needed me to help her bridge the gap. I read every word slowly, letting them wash over me like cold water. And with each one, memories rose. Me standing on her doorstep with that single suitcase, her eyes skimming past my fear, her voice wrapped in hesitation that meant no. I tried to imagine stepping in now, easing her burden, giving her what she had refused to give me. But something inside me had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was finally drawing a boundary I should have drawn years ago. A boundary that said I mattered too. I thought about the nights in my car when the cold pushed into my bones. I thought about eating crackers in a parking lot while she laughed at a dinner table I would never be invited to. Those weren't moments I wanted repaid. They were moments I refused to repeat. So I made my decision. I would not rescue them. I would let the consequences unfold, not out of cruelty, but because saving them now would undo everything I had clawed back for myself. And as her messages grew quieter, I sensed the next step approaching. The moment they would begin packing their lives into boxes, preparing to leave. They started packing a few days after the last message went quiet. From my window across the street, I watched the slow rhythm of cardboard boxes appearing on the porch, one after another, like a quiet surrender laid out in the sun. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic scenes, just a tired kind of movement. The kind people make when they've run out of options and the fight has drained out of them. I stood there most mornings with my coffee, feeling each small moment land heavier than the last. This wasn't what I ever pictured for us. That house had once been a place I dreamed my daughter would grow into, a place where she might build a life sturdier than mine had been. But watching her load those boxes, the house stopped looking like hope. It looked like distance. It looked like all the space that had grown between us long before any lease expired. When the moving truck finally pulled up, the air felt strangely still. I noticed the way Megan moved, slow, guarded, exhausted. I noticed the silence between her and her husband, the same silence that now stretched between her and me. And when the truck door shut for the last time, my chest tightened with a sadness that had no name. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was simply the cost of choices, hers and mine. As their car rolled down the street, I felt something inside me settle and break at the same time. The house stood empty, and so did the space between us. And in that quiet, I knew it was time to face what all of this truly meant. When the street finally grew quiet again, I felt a kind of stillness settle over me. The house stood empty across the way, and for the first time in a long while, there was no tension pulling at my chest. Just space. Just breath. I let myself sit with that. No running, no surviving, no bracing for the next wound. Only the quiet truth of where life had taken me. I thought back to everything that had happened waking up to smoke at 2:30 a.m., watching my home burn, the months in that car, the silence from Megan when I needed her most, then the slow climb back to myself, the payout, the choices, the ownership, the reveal, and now, an ending I never imagined but somehow understand. What I've learned is that standing up for myself came with a cost, but so did not standing up. I used to think love meant absorbing every hurt, waiting for someone to come around, hoping they'd see me. Now I know love also means protecting the part of me that survived when everything else fell apart. I won't pretend this ending is clean. It's tender and sore and complicated, but it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, I feel steady inside my own life. Boundaries saved me when hope couldn't. If you've lived through something like this, loss, hard choices, the kind of heartbreak that reshapes you, I hope you'll share your story. Someone out there might need to hear it.